Okay, today I'm going to be talking about why Marx was wrong and what of his theories doesn't match up to what we can see and look back in history from this present moment, did not come true or was false at the time. And the first thing I want to mention is that the vast majority, probably 90 to 95% of what Marx wrote about was an analysis of the world he was living in the mid-1800s. And it was a critique of mid-1800s European capitalism. So Marx actually wrote very little about socialism or communism. But what you can find when he wrote about those things, it's in either the Communist Manifesto or Critique of the Gotha Program, where we see a little bit of his thoughts on what kind of society we should build as opposed to just what not to do. And so first, let's talk about what he got wrong in his analysis. And there's like a number of smaller things that we could point to. But the big one is the labor theory of value. Now, Marx took his labor theory of value from people like Adam Smith and David Ricardo. And if you haven't read either Smith or Marx, it might surprise you that Marx took things from Smith, because Smith is seen as this, laissez-faire guy, but that's really not how Smith was at all. And the reality is you can see a lot of points of agreement between Smith and Marx. Smith was very distrustful of the rich and the power that they had the potential to hold if their wealth was concentrated. And Marx obviously agreed on that. But in terms of a market system and how that would function, how it would play out, they definitely had a disagreement. But in terms of labor theory of value, so this was kind of an old, from the early days of economics, like Adam Smith, and as I said, David Ricardo, they had this idea that the intrinsic worth of a commodity came from how much labor was put into it. There's different ways that they kind of calculated it, but economics is really not that exact of a science today. It's called the Dismal Science. And it was far less of a hard science back then. Smith was a moral philosopher. Marx, specialized in the classics. And so these were people who were taking this new field of economics and trying to understand, what makes society work. In Smith's case, what makes a society wealthy, and in Marx's case, what makes a society break down for a large portion of society. So in labor theory of value, Smith, Ricardo, they all understood it as the intrinsic value of a commodity is wrapped up in how much labor was put into it. So Marx took this and he tried to run with it. And what he said was that the price of a commodity could be determined by how much labor was put into it. Of course, this is completely neglecting, capital or machinery or automation, which I think later on Marx understood a little bit better. But certainly when he's putting forward these ideas in kind of his big works, he seems to, go off in this theory that would be really tough to confirm at the time, but we've definitely proven false since then. That, thinking of an example, the Luddites, they were putting in a lot of labor, but then machines were made where far less labor was necessary to get the same value. So that, you had that acts as a pretty clear disproving of Marx's labor theory of value. Okay, next one that Marx got wrong, and this is his prediction. So you have to understand, Marx derived a lot of understanding for the direction history was going from this guy named Hegel. He was part of the young Hegelians, and it's actually interesting to read about the young Hegelians in the mid-1800s in Europe, like Prussia, Germany. Max Stirner, who is considered by some to be the worst philosopher to ever live. Stirner and Marx, kind of went at it. They were like the rival thinkers in the young Hegelians. So anyway, you had this idea from Hegel that Marx developed called historical materialism. And you might hear people talking about dialectical materialism, where there's a thesis and antithesis and they come together and form a synthesis. But what we're talking about here is basically history moves in a certain direction. And for Marx, that was we started off in these tribal societies, then we moved to feudalism, then mercantilism, then capitalism. And Marx said the inevitable progression next is first to socialism and then to communism. So that was his idea. And it's important to realize that when Marx was saying this, those words socialism and communism meant different things. Socialism to Marx was a democratically controlled economy, and communism was a complete elimination of both capitalism and the state. The idea of communism to Marx was, a stateless, classless, moneyless society, just this kind of utopia where nobody governed anybody else. So that's what Marx thought was going to happen. And in the Communist Manifesto is where he really writes this idea of the withering away of the state. So his understanding of historical materialism was that, the workers would, basically rise up, and then we would implement socialism, which was where the working class revolution would take over the state, and they would take over the factories. And then once the workers had taken over the factories, capitalism would be gone, and then the state would disappear. Marx's words is the state would wither away. So, we've gotten to a point in history where, inequality has gotten bigger. So you would think that if that was going to happen by now, maybe it would have happened. We've had a couple experiments in countries that called themselves socialist. And we have an instance after instance, where, some kind of revolutionary group rises up, or there's kind of a political revolution that happens through the polls, and you have, what is called a socialist state, but we've never really seen something look like what Marx is talking about, like a truly democratic state, and it's never evolved into communism. So I'm going to break down a couple reasons why that's wrong. So one, when you concentrate power into the hands of the state, so the whole economy is run through basically state bureaucrats, they're going to take power for themselves as opposed to governing for the people, unless there's some kind of strong check and balance, some mechanism for the people to have power. And this idea of where these technocratic elites rule society, basically, that's idea is called the Vanguard Party, and it was developed under Lenin, so you tend to hear the term Leninism. And so not only have we never gotten to a democratic socialist state, but we've never gotten to communism, because this idea that once we've achieved that, the state would wither away, that's never happened. And I think there's still some, it's very rare that people still subscribe to that concept laid out in the Communist Manifesto. But I did hear, he's a Marxist critic, Frederick Jameson, and he talked about, his ideal Marxist utopia is where everybody works for the state, so essentially there is no state. And that seemed so absurd to me, because we've already run this experiment with the Soviet Union and Maoist China and, all these things. And their idea is it's going to be different this time, which, is just not really something that I think most people could accept. Another one is the inevitability of class consciousness. So Marx said that basically, over time, capitalists are going to accumulate more capital, workers are going to be more squeezed, and so workers are going to eventually wake up and see what's going on and revolt and overthrow capitalism, and then that's how the historical materialism evolves. Then you get socialism, then you get communism. So, why has the poor and working class, the large majority of society, why have they not developed class consciousness? So I would say there's multiple things. One is a theory developed by kind of a libertarian Marxist in 1967 in a book called Society of the Spectacle. That was Guy Debord. He was a French writer, and it's this idea that the spectacle, which at the time was television, movies, I think now we could say internet, smartphones, video games, all those kind of things, distract us, kind of act as a bread and circuses or opiate of the masses kind of thing. And so we become apolitical and we don't really care, or maybe we care a little bit, but we're not willing to do research on, what's going on in Washington or what's going on in our local state house or city hall. It's more boring than watching Game of Thrones or playing Candy Crush or whatever. Another one is another reason the working class has failed to gain class consciousness is because of a theory called the propaganda model developed by Edward Herman and put into book form by Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky in a book called Manufacturing Consent. And this is an idea that dates back to about World War I time. There's these two guys kind of really considered liberals, but really kind of nefarious in their ideas. One was Walter Lippmann, and the other one was Edward Bernays. Bernays wrote a book called Propaganda, and Lippmann wrote a book called Public Opinion. And it was basically how to shape public opinion. And these guys, they basically went from working for the Woodrow Wilson administration, basically teaching them how to gin up support for the war. You make people feel patriotic. They went right from there to, after the war, they went to Madison Avenue and taught corporate America how to develop, techniques to make people buy things and think favorably of your corporation, that kind of thing. And, I think the theories of Chomsky and Herman, or Herman and Chomsky, as Chomsky would say, because Herman developed propaganda model, their theories were really carried out and developed and updated by Matt Taibbi of Rolling Stone, who wrote a book called Hate Inc. And it's a phenomenal book. If you wanted to understand media, like if you want to even have the beginnings of understanding of media, I would say you have to read Manufacturing Consent by Herman and Chomsky and Hate Inc. by Matt Taibbi. Phenomenal books, and it'll change the way you see the world. So the fact that, the way we view the world is basically either propaganda or distraction is why the lower classes haven't developed class consciousness. And the fourth reason I would give as to why Marx is wrong is the impossibility of revolution. So, Marx just saw, once enough, the masses realize that the elites have all the power and they don't, they're going to rise up and take power. Well, that was actually possible in 1917 when the Soviets, the Bolsheviks, took over. And obviously, as I mentioned, it didn't go as they planned it to, and a lot of, kind of true Marxists went to the gulags for that. But the reality is it was at least possible to undergo the revolution part. Nowadays, you have, let's say in the United States of America, you have a population where there's tons of small arms, 300 plus million small arms in the hands of civilians. But if you try to have a revolution, you'd be going against a government with Predator drones and Abrams tanks and Apache helicopters and, precision guided missiles. You'd be wiped out instantly. Anytime there was anybody in groups, and groups collectively gathering together are what a revolutionary movement needs. Anytime that happened, they just wipe you out. And we saw this on a much smaller scale with Occupy Wall Street, where, there was encampments. Obama gave Bloomberg the go-ahead. He said, do what you need to do. Bloomberg went in with bulldozers and mass arrests with police and cleared them out. So not even a revolution, but even a mass movement is becoming very difficult in this stage of, kind of authoritarian capitalism, you might say. So those are the reasons that I think Marx got things wrong, and I don't think that means Marx is not a person to listen to. I think he had a lot of good ideas, but it's important to acknowledge that nobody's perfect, and it's important to acknowledge that some things were, we can easily look at and say that's not the direction we want to go. We can look at history and say, let's take a different direction. So with Marx, as with anybody, you got to look at the light and the dark, the good and the bad. So that's all I got. Thanks.